In this podcast episode, Tommy Robinson shares his insights on the impact of Islamic immigration and extremism in Britain, the political dynamics surrounding these issues, and warns about similar threats facing the United States. He discusses his personal experiences with law enforcement and political persecution, the grooming and abuse scandals in the UK, the influence of Muslim Brotherhood-related groups, and the broader geopolitical implications involving Iran, Israel, and American politics. Tommy also reflects on cultural and spiritual revival movements in Britain and calls for unity and resistance against what he sees as growing Islamist influence. Tommy Robinson explains how his activism was sparked by witnessing the drastic cultural and demographic changes in his hometown, Luton, which shifted from having one mosque to dozens, and where Muslims became the majority population. The hostility, violence, and police inaction he witnessed, especially linked to grooming gangs targeting young girls, were catalysts for his outspoken stance. A turning point was when soldiers were attacked during a homecoming parade by terrorist groups. His experience includes multiple imprisonments and constant legal battles, which he attributes to lawfare, using the legal system as a weapon to silence him for exposing crimes and governmental failures. Tommy details the scale of grooming and sexual abuse perpetrated mainly by gangs of Muslim men against underage non-Muslim girls in Britain. He describes how these crimes were systematically ignored or covered up by police and prosecutors, often out of fear of being labeled racist or to protect political vote banks, particularly benefiting the Labour Party. He recounts horrific abuses, including torture and murder, which remain largely unprosecuted due to resource constraints and institutional reluctance. The grooming phenomenon, he argues, is not isolated to Britain, but prevalent across Europe and other Western countries, particularly where large Muslim immigrant populations exist. A significant portion of the discussion focuses on the Muslim Brotherhood's documented 1990 plan to infiltrate and dismantle Western civilization through deception and political influence. Tommy points to their active presence and network within the United States, including hundreds of mosques and numerous organizations pushing Islamist agendas. He stresses that Islam itself, as codified in the Quran and by the teachings of Muhammad, calls for conquest and subjugation of non-Muslims, not merely extremist offshoots. Drawing on historical examples like the Barbary pirates and Thomas Jefferson's writings, he claims that Islamic doctrine inherently instructs perpetual conflict with non-Muslims, a reality ignored by many modern commentators. Tommy discusses how immigration policies have been manipulated to create loyal vote banks, which protect political parties from electoral defeat, particularly the Democrats in the US and Labour in the UK. He argues that open borders and mass immigration, particularly from countries with high support for Sharia law, such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia, have increased security risks, social fragmentation, and political influence for Islamist groups. He contrasts this with immigration from other cultural backgrounds, asserting that these Muslim-majority immigrant groups have brought cultural values incompatible with Western democracy and freedom, including widespread support for harsh religious punishments and intolerance towards Christians and Jews. Tommy reflects on his recent experiences in the US, highlighting the openness with which Islamist groups operate, including their explicit calls for the murder of Jews and Christians. He warns of the growing Sharia caucus in Congress and the political influence Islamist groups have gained, especially in key states like Texas, where hundreds of mosques and Islamic organizations actively seek political and social change. He expresses strong support for Donald Trump and American patriots, viewing their fight as a defense not only of the U.S., but of the entire Western civilization's future. He also discusses his visa experience and the warm reception he received from some American political figures and citizens, contrasting it with the repression he faced in Britain. The podcast explores the conflict involving Iran, which Tommy characterizes as a fundamentalist Islamic regime hostile to the West and responsible for funding terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. He praises Donald Trump's policies towards confronting Iran and criticizes previous administrations' perceived appeasement or weakness. Tommy underscores the dangers of Iran's nuclear ambitions and the existential threat they pose. He dismisses conspiracy theories about Israeli control over U.S. policy, instead asserting that the U.S. government itself seeks to confront Iran for strategic reasons. He also condemns European governments for failing to support the U.S. and for allowing Muslim populations that might incite violence on their streets. Tommy emphasizes a cultural and spiritual revival movement growing in the UK, one that seeks to restore Christian and Judeo-Christian values as the foundation of British identity and society. He describes organizing mass peaceful protests and events that have drawn hundreds of thousands, promoting free speech, opposition to mass immigration, and resistance to what he sees as leftist indoctrination in schools. He highlights the role of music, faith, and community as central to this movement and stresses its distinction from purely political activism. The revival, he believes, is awakening a lion in the British spirit that had been dormant. Robinson discusses his own censorship, bannings from social media platforms, and legal persecution, but credits Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter and restoration of his account as a turning point that empowered dissenting voices in Britain. He warns against mainstream media, labeling it corrupt and biased, urging audiences instead to support independent media outlets that give voice to these discussions. He highlights ongoing efforts to criminalize the exposure of corruption and fraud, particularly in places like California, and stresses the importance of preserving free speech and resisting governmental and corporate suppression. Through the interview, Tommy shares his personal struggles with imprisonment, threats, and attacks, including challenges against his family. Despite this, he presents an optimistic vision anchored in faith, identity, and grassroots activism. He expresses gratitude for American support, admiration for Trump's leadership, and hope that future political and cultural tides will turn in favor of resisting Islamist influence and preserving Western civilization's values. He concludes with an invitation to listeners to engage with grassroots movements, independent media, and community-building efforts to counter these challenges.